I still remember the exact sentence my mom loved to say whenever relatives visited our house. "Don't worry about Stella, just look at your sister." She said it so casually, like I wasn't even sitting at the table. My sister, Emily Carter, had the life my mom loved to show off. Perfect job in Seattle. Perfect fiancé in finance. Perfect photos on social media that made our family look successful. And then there was me. The dropout, my mom would say with a tight smile. The one who never finished anything. Every holiday dinner turned into a comparison. Every conversation somehow ended with Emily being the example and me being the warning. After a while, people stopped asking about me at all, which was convenient. Because while my family was busy admiring Emily's perfect life, I was quietly building something they never noticed. A company. One that, by the time my mom told everyone to ignore me again, was worth $97 million. And the moment they finally found out, that was the moment everything in our family began to change. My name is Stella Carter, and for most of my life, I was the person people forgot was in the room. Not because I was quiet, not because I didn't try, but because my family had already decided who the important daughter was. And it wasn't me. My sister Emily Carter was 2 years older, and from the moment we were kids, the entire family orbit revolved around her. Emily was what my mom called the success story. Straight A's, student government, honor societies, business school at Northwestern University. Everything Emily did became a celebration. I remember the night she got into college. Mom opened a bottle of champagne in the kitchen and called every relative we had. "My daughter got into Northwestern," she kept saying proudly. I stood next to the counter holding the acceptance letter from my own university. Full scholarship. But nobody asked about it. Mom hugged Emily. Dad shook her hand like she had just closed a business deal. Then Mom finally turned toward me and said, "Oh right, Stella got into state too." That was it. No celebration. No phone calls. Just a quick acknowledgement before the attention returned to Emily. I learned something important that night. In our house, success wasn't measured by effort. It was measured by expectation. Emily was expected to succeed. So everything she did looked impressive. I was expected to struggle. So even my achievements looked average. The comparisons followed us everywhere. At Christmas, Emily's pile of presents looked like a department store display. Designer clothes, electronics, concert tickets. I usually received practical things. A planner, a desk organizer. Once, when I was 17, Mom handed me a box containing a set of file folders. "Organization is important for someone like you," she said. Emily opened a brand new laptop 15 minutes later. Mom explained it quickly. Emily appreciates technology more. I didn't argue. Arguing never helped. Family dinners were the worst. Someone would always ask Emily about her career plans. She would talk about consulting, internships, networking events. Mom would beam with pride. Then someone would look at me. "And what about you, Stella?" Before I could answer, Mom would jump in. "She's still figuring things out." I heard that sentence so many times it became part of my identity. Still figuring things out. It sounded harmless. But what it really meant was not impressive enough to discuss. The strange thing was I believed it for a while. When you grow up hearing the same story about yourself, it slowly becomes the truth in your mind. Emily was the talented one. Emily was the future success. Emily was the daughter worth investing in. And me? I was just the extra chapter no one planned to read. By the time we reached adulthood, the difference between us had become even more obvious. Emily moved to Seattle, started working at a consulting firm, and quickly climbed the corporate ladder. Mom told everyone about it. She's already managing major clients. She'll probably become partner one day. She's marrying into a wonderful family. Meanwhile, my life looked smaller. At least from the outside. I lived in a small apartment in Tacoma. I drove a used Honda Civic. And whenever relatives asked what I did for work, I gave the same simple answer. I work in customer support. Which technically wasn't a lie. I answered customer questions. I solved problems. I helped clients. I just didn't mention one small detail. Those customers belonged to my company. But my family never asked enough questions to discover that. And eventually, I stopped volunteering information. Because I needed to understand something first. If I failed, would they still respect me? Would they still treat me like their daughter? Or was love in our family something you had to earn through visible success? For 4 years, I watched carefully. I listened to every comparison, every dismissive comment, every time my mom told someone, "Just look at Emily." And slowly, the answer became painfully obvious. In my family, attention followed success. Respect followed status. And until the world proved otherwise, I would always be the daughter nobody looked at. If my life felt invisible growing up, Emily's life felt like a spotlight. Everything she did became a story my mom loved to tell. Whenever relatives visited, Mom would pull out her phone and start scrolling through photos like she was presenting a highlight reel. Look at Emily's office. Look at the view from her apartment. Look at the new restaurant she and David tried last weekend. My sister's life wasn't just successful. It was photogenic. Emily worked for a consulting firm in downtown Seattle, and according to my mom, she was one promotion away from running the entire department. Whether that was true or not didn't really matter. In Mom's version of reality, Emily was already a legend. Her fiancé, David Lawson, came from one of those families people describe with lowered voices. The kind that owns businesses, sits on charity boards, and seems to know everyone important in the city. David's parents owned several private medical clinics across Washington. Mom adored them immediately. "They're such an elegant family," she told everyone. Very refined. Emily and David lived in a sleek apartment overlooking the water. When Mom visited them for the first time, she came home glowing. "You should see it, Stella," she said. "Floor-to-ceiling windows. Designer furniture. It's like something out of a magazine." Then she glanced around my apartment. My tiny kitchen. My thrift store couch. The folding dining table I had bought online. Mom sighed. "Well, different lifestyles, I suppose." That sentence stuck with me. Different lifestyles. She said it the way someone might describe two completely different species. Emily's life was the polished version. Mine was the unfinished draft. The real turning point came the day Emily announced her engagement. It happened during Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Mom had cooked an enormous meal, and relatives were packed around the dining table. Emily stood up halfway through dinner and held out her hand. The diamond rings sparkled under the kitchen lights. "I said yes," she said. The room exploded with excitement. Mom gasped and grabbed her arm. "Oh my God, it's beautiful." Dad immediately opened a bottle of wine. Phones came out. Photos were taken. Within minutes, Mom was already discussing wedding plans. "Next summer," she said excitedly. "A big venue. 200 guests at least." Emily laughed. "Mom, slow down." But Mom was unstoppable. "My daughter deserves the perfect wedding." Then she turned toward me. "And Stella will help with everything, of course." I smiled politely. "Sure." No one asked if I had plans that summer. No one asked what I thought. I was simply assigned a supporting role. That night, after dinner, Mom walked me to the door. "You should learn from Emily," she said quietly. "Learn what?" I asked. "How to build a stable life." She looked around at my car parked in the driveway. The same Honda Civic I'd driven for years. "You're almost 27, Stella." Her voice softened, but the message stayed sharp. "At some point you need to grow up." I nodded. "Maybe you're right." Mom seemed relieved. She hugged me quickly before going back inside. But as I drove away that night, something about her words didn't hurt the way they used to. Instead, they felt strangely distant. Because the truth was, my life wasn't unstable. It was just invisible to her. And the thing about invisible work is that people don't see it until it suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. At that moment, while my mom was planning Emily's dream wedding, my company had just signed contracts with 300 new restaurants. Our logistics network was expanding into 2 new states, and investors had started asking a question I had never expected to hear. "How soon are you planning your next funding round?" My life wasn't falling behind Emily's. It was simply unfolding somewhere my family had never bothered to look. But the moment they finally noticed, that moment was coming faster than any of them realized. The truth about my life started during my second year of college. At the time, I was studying business at a state university outside Seattle. I had good grades, a full scholarship, and a schedule so packed it barely left room to breathe. From the outside, everything looked normal. But during that year, I noticed something strange. I was working part-time at a small cafe near campus to help cover living expenses. It was the kind of place that made great food but constantly struggled to stay profitable. One evening the owner, Rachel Bennett, was staring at a stack of invoices with a frustrated expression. "Wholesale prices went up again," she sighed. I asked what she meant. Rachel shook her head. "Small businesses like us get terrible supply deals," she explained. "Large restaurant chains get bulk pricing. The rest of us pay almost double." The problem sounded simple at first. But the more people I talked to, the more I realized how widespread it was. Food trucks, cafes, local bakeries, small restaurants. They were all dealing with the same issue. Big distributors ignored them because their orders were too small. Premium suppliers offered contracts that only large companies could afford, which meant thousands of small food businesses were stuck paying higher prices than the big chains. One night while studying in the library, a thought suddenly clicked into place. What if those small businesses combined their orders? Instead of one restaurant ordering 10 units, what if 100 restaurants ordered together? Suddenly their purchasing power would match the big companies. The idea sounded almost too obvious, but no one seemed to be doing it. So I started researching. For 3 months I barely slept. I studied logistics systems, supplier contracts, distribution networks, and slowly, a plan began forming. I built a basic website and called the concept Harvest Bridge Supply. The idea was simple. We would act as a shared purchasing network for small food businesses. Restaurants could join our platform, place orders, and we would aggregate those orders to negotiate bulk pricing with suppliers. It sounded ambitious. But the moment I tested it, something unexpected happened. Restaurants started signing up immediately. Our first month, we had 12 clients. I handled deliveries myself using a rented van and a borrowed tablet for order tracking. It was exhausting, but it worked. Within 6 months, we had 80 clients. A year later, that number reached 450. At that point, something became clear. This was no longer a side project. It was a real business. A fast-growing one. And it needed my full attention. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I left college. When I told my parents, the reaction was exactly what you would expect. Mom stared at me like I had just thrown my future into the ocean. "You're quitting school?" she asked. "I'm not quitting," I said carefully. "I'm building a company." Mom shook her head. "Stella, this is exactly what I was worried about." Dad sighed. "You're making a huge mistake." They never asked what the company did. They never asked how many clients we had. They never asked how much revenue we were making. Instead, Mom told relatives the simplified version. Stella dropped out. That story spread quickly through the family. And eventually it became my identity. The dropout. The daughter who couldn't finish college. At first, I tried correcting people. But after a while I stopped. Because the business was growing faster than I could explain. By the end of the second year, Harvest Bridge Supply had over 1,800 clients. We hired our first operations manager, then a logistics coordinator, then a small customer support team. Investors started reaching out. The first funding offer came from a venture capital firm in San Francisco. When the deal closed, our company valuation jumped into 8 figures. But even then, I kept my lifestyle simple. Same apartment, same car, same quiet answers whenever my family asked what I did. I work in customer support. Technically, that wasn't a lie. I answered customer emails. I solved delivery issues. I helped restaurant owners navigate the platform. I just didn't mention the part where those thousands of customers were part of the company I had built from scratch. By the time Harvest Bridge Supply closed its second funding round, the numbers had become almost surreal. Over 6,500 restaurants were using our network. Our logistics hubs operated in 5 states. And after our most recent investment round, the company was officially valued at $97 million. I was 27 years old, and my family still believed I worked a modest support job while trying to figure out my life. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if they discovered the truth. Would they feel proud? Embarrassed? Or would they simply pretend they had known all along? For 4 years, that question remained unanswered. But the moment everything changed arrived in the most unexpected place possible. At my sister's engagement party. And that night, my secret didn't stay secret anymore. Emily's engagement party was held on a warm Saturday evening in early June. The venue was a rooftop lounge overlooking Lake Washington, the kind of place with soft golden lights, polished marble floors, and servers walking around with trays of champagne. Everything about the event felt expensive. Which made sense. David's family had paid for most of it. When I stepped out of the elevator and onto the rooftop, I immediately felt that familiar sensation I always experienced at family gatherings. Like I had somehow wandered into the wrong scene. My mom, Linda Carter, was standing near the entrance greeting guests. She was wearing a silver dress and the kind of smile she only used when she wanted to impress people. When she saw me, the smile flickered for half a second. "Oh," she said, sounding slightly surprised. "Stella came." I gave a small shrug. "You invited me." "Yes, of course," she replied quickly, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Just try not to disappear into a corner, okay? People will ask questions." I almost laughed. Questions about what? My life? That had never interested her before. The rooftop was filled with about 60 people. Most of them were David's friends, coworkers, and relatives. Well-dressed. Confident. The kind of people who talked about investment portfolios and vacation homes like it was casual small talk. Emily stood near the center of the room beside David, glowing with the attention. She was wearing a pale blue dress, and her engagement ring flashed every time she moved her hand. Every few minutes someone would approach them to say congratulations. Mom hovered nearby, proudly introducing Emily to anyone who would listen. "That's my daughter," she kept saying. Eventually, Emily noticed me standing near the bar. She walked over with a bright smile. "Stella, you made it." "Of course," I said. She hugged me quickly, then stepped back and looked around. "You're okay, right?" she asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "You know tonight might feel a little awkward." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Emily hesitated. "Well, David's family is very accomplished." I almost smiled. Translation: "Don't embarrass us." "I'll survive," I said calmly. She looked relieved and returned to her fiancé. For the next hour I stayed near the edge of the party, sipping sparkling water and watching the room. Conversations flowed easily around me. Someone talked about venture capital. Another group discussed real estate investments. A few people mentioned startups they had invested in. Ironically, the entire evening revolved around the exact world I lived in every day. But nobody knew that. To them, I was simply Emily's quiet younger sister. At one point, I overheard two women talking near the bar. "Emily is incredible," one of them said. "David really found someone impressive." The other woman nodded. "Good families produce successful children." My mom walked past them at that moment and smiled proudly. Then one of the women glanced toward me. "And who's that?" Mom waved casually. "Oh, that's Stella." The woman waited for more explanation. Mom laughed lightly. "She dropped out of college a few years ago. She's still figuring things out." The woman gave a polite nod. Ah. That single word carried the same meaning I had heard 1,000 times. Not important. The conversation immediately shifted back to Emily. I turned slightly toward the bar, letting the noise of the party fade into the background. Normally, comments like that would have stung. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the long hours I had spent building my company. Maybe it was the confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that my family's opinion no longer defined me. I checked my phone. 3 new emails from investors. 2 messages from restaurant partners. 1 update from our logistics team. Harvest Bridge Supply had just finalized contracts with 2 major regional suppliers. Our network was expanding faster than ever. And yet here I was, standing at a rooftop party where people thought I was a struggling dropout. The irony was almost funny. A few minutes later, one of David's colleagues approached the bar and ordered a drink. He glanced at me. "Are you with the Carter family?" he asked. "Yes." "You're Emily's sister, right?" Stella. He smiled politely. I'm Michael Grant. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. We chatted casually for a few minutes about Seattle traffic, restaurants, and the view from the rooftop. Then something strange happened. Michael studied my face more carefully. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to sudden recognition. Wait a second, he said slowly. Stella Carter? I felt my stomach drop slightly, because suddenly I remembered exactly who he was. Michael Grant wasn't just a guest at the party. He was one of the venture capital investors who had participated in our Series B funding round. And judging by the look on his face, he had just realized the same thing. For a few seconds, Michael Grant just stared at me. Not in a rude way. More like someone trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly made sense. Stella Carter, he repeated. I gave a small nod. Yes. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. Well, that's unexpected. I let out a quiet laugh. You could say that. Michael glanced across the rooftop where my mom and Emily were laughing with a group of guests. Then he looked back at me. Does your family know? I shook my head. No, he opened his mouth like he was about to ask another question, but at that exact moment my mom's voice cut through the music. Everyone, can I have your attention for a moment? Conversations around the rooftop slowly faded. Emily and David stepped toward the center of the space, smiling as guests gathered closer. Mom raised her glass. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight, she said proudly. This is such a special moment for our family. She wrapped one arm around Emily. My daughter has worked so hard to build a beautiful life. Guests applauded lightly. Mom continued, her voice warm with admiration. Emily has always been the daughter who knew exactly what she wanted. Another round of approving murmurs. Then she glanced around the crowd. And David comes from such a wonderful, successful family. David's parents smiled politely. Mom seemed completely in her element now. I feel incredibly lucky to watch these two begin their future together. She paused dramatically before adding, and as a mother, nothing makes me happier than seeing your child succeed. The applause grew louder. Then someone near the back of the crowd asked casually, and what about your other daughter? For a split second, I saw Mom's expression tighten. She laughed lightly. Oh, Stella. Several people turned to look at me. Mom waved a dismissive hand. Stella is still finding her path. The familiar sentence. The same one she had repeated for years. She left college a while ago, Mom continued. Right now she works in customer support. A few polite smiles appeared around the room. Mom leaned closer to Emily with a playful laugh. But if you want to see what success looks like. She raised her glass toward my sister. Just look at Emily. The crowd chuckled. Some nodded approvingly. And for a moment, the room returned to its comfortable narrative. Emily, the successful daughter. Stella, the one still figuring things out. Except this time the narrative didn't last very long. Because next to me, Michael Grant quietly said, I think I should probably say something. I turned toward him. You don't have to. But Michael had already stepped forward. The room was still gathered around my mom when he cleared his throat. Actually, he said politely, I'd like to add something. Mom looked slightly confused. Yes. Michael gestured toward me. You mentioned Stella works in customer support. That's right, Mom replied. Michael smiled. Well, technically that's true. The room waited. He continued calmly. But Stella is also the founder and CEO of Harvest Bridge Supply. The words seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, nobody reacted. Mom blinked. I'm sorry, what? Michael spoke clearly. Harvest Bridge Supply. The food logistics platform that recently expanded across 5 states. Several people in the crowd suddenly leaned closer. One man pulled out his phone. Another whispered something to his wife. Michael continued. The company just completed a funding round earlier this year. Mom still looked confused. So she works there? Michael shook his head. No. Then he smiled slightly. She owns it. Silence spread across the rooftop. The music still played softly in the background, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. My mom stared at me like she had never seen me before. That company, she said slowly. The one that was in the business news last month? Michael nodded. Yes. David looked stunned. Wait, Harvest Bridge Supply? Emily's voice came out barely above a whisper. You built that. I shrugged. Yeah. Someone in the crowd suddenly spoke up. Isn't that the company valued around 90 million? Michael corrected him calmly. 97 million. A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the room. Phones appeared everywhere. People started searching online. Within seconds, the first person turned their screen toward the group. There's an article. Another voice added. She's right here in the photo. And suddenly, the entire rooftop was staring at me. Not as Emily's sister. Not as the dropout. But as the person they had completely misjudged. My mom's face had turned pale. Emily looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under her. David's parents exchanged quiet, thoughtful glances. And in the center of it all, my mother finally said the only thing she could think of. Stella. Her voice sounded small now. Why didn't you tell us? I met her eyes calmly. Because you never asked. For several seconds after I said those words, the rooftop remained completely silent. Not the polite silence people use at formal events. This was the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes something important at the same time. My mom was still staring at me. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Emily looked like someone had just erased the script she had been following her entire life. David's parents exchanged another quiet glance. Around us, guests were whispering. Phones were still out. Someone had already found the article Michael mentioned. I heard one man say quietly, "Yeah, that's definitely her." Another woman leaned closer to her screen. It says she founded the company 4 years ago. Mom slowly lowered her glass. 4 years, she repeated. Her eyes moved back to me. You built that company 4 years ago? Yes. Her voice trembled slightly. And you never told us? I kept my tone calm. You told everyone I was a dropout. That's not the same thing, she said quickly. Isn't it? The question hung between us. For the first time in my life, my mother didn't have an immediate answer. Emily finally stepped forward. Her voice was quieter now. Stella, how big is the company? Michael answered before I could. Harvest Bridge Supply currently supports over 6,000 restaurants across the Northwest. Several people nearby gasped softly. David looked genuinely stunned. That's the company our hospital cafeteria just partnered with, he said slowly. Michael nodded. That sounds right. David looked back at me. So you're the reason our supply costs dropped last quarter? I shrugged slightly. Probably. The conversation around us started growing louder. Now people were approaching. A man in a navy suit introduced himself. I run 3 restaurants in Bellevue, he said. Your platform saved our business last year. Another guest smiled warmly. My sister owns a bakery in Portland. She uses Harvest Bridge. Suddenly, the attention in the room had completely shifted. The same people who had politely ignored me earlier were now asking questions. About logistics. About expansion. About my business model. I answered calmly, keeping my voice steady. But in the middle of all that attention, I noticed something strange. Emily had stepped slightly back. For the first time all evening, she wasn't the center of the room anymore. And my mom. My mom looked like she had just discovered a part of the world she had never bothered to explore. Eventually the party resumed. Music started again. People returned to conversations. But the atmosphere had changed. The narrative that had existed at the beginning of the evening had quietly collapsed. Emily was still getting married. She still had the impressive career. But now there was another story in the room. One that nobody had expected. About the dropout sister who had quietly built a company worth $97 million. About the daughter everyone overlooked. Later that night, as guests began leaving, my mom approached me again. Her voice sounded different now. More careful. Stella, can we talk? I nodded. We stepped toward a quieter corner of the rooftop. The city lights reflected off the lake below us. Mom crossed her arms, looking uncomfortable. I don't understand why you hid this from us. I studied her face for a moment before answering. I didn't hide it. Yes, you did, she insisted. You never mentioned the company. I shook my head. You never asked about my life. She opened her mouth to argue, then paused. Because we both knew that part was true. Mom looked away toward the water. I thought you were struggling, she said softly. I thought you had made a mistake leaving school. I didn't leave school because I failed, I replied. I left because the business needed me. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. How much is the company worth? 97 million. She inhaled sharply. And you built that by yourself? Not by myself, I said. I have a team now. But you started it. Yes. Mom stared out over the lake again. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I may have misjudged you. The words felt strange. Not because they were harsh, but because they were the closest thing to an apology my mother had ever given me. Behind us, I could hear Emily laughing again with guests. The party continued. But something fundamental had shifted that night. For years, my family had believed a simple story. Emily was the successful daughter. Stella was the disappointment. And in less than 5 minutes, that story had completely fallen apart. The engagement party ended later than expected. Guests slowly filtered toward the elevators, still whispering about what had happened earlier. Some people shook my hand before leaving. Others asked if Harvest Bridge Supply was planning to expand into their cities. A few even asked for my business card. But the strangest part of the evening wasn't the attention. It was watching my family adjust to a reality they had never imagined. Emily stood near the balcony with David, smiling politely as guests said goodbye. From a distance, she still looked confident. But I knew my sister well enough to see the difference. Her shoulders were tighter. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The spotlight had shifted for the first time in her life, and she didn't know how to stand outside of it. When the last group of guests left, Emily finally walked toward me. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. You built all of that? She asked quietly. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I gave a small shrug. You never asked either. Emily exhaled slowly. I thought you hated business. I hated the way people talked about success, I replied. What do you mean? I leaned against the railing. Growing up, success meant looking impressive. Emily frowned slightly. Good schools. Fancy jobs. Expensive things. She glanced down at her engagement ring. That's not a bad thing. No, I said. But it's not the only thing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily surprised me. I didn't know Mom talked about you like that, she said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. You didn't. She shook her head. I thought she was encouraging you. I laughed softly. That's one way to describe it. Emily looked genuinely troubled. I guess I never paid attention. That's the thing about being the favorite, I said gently. You don't notice the comparisons. She looked down at the floor. I'm sorry, Stella. The words sounded sincere. Not dramatic. Not rehearsed. Just honest. Before I could respond, another voice joined the conversation. David's father approached us. Richard Lawson was a tall man with calm, observant eyes. He had barely spoken to me earlier in the evening. Now he extended his hand. Miss Carter. I shook it. Nice to finally meet you properly, he said. You too. Richard studied me for a moment. My family values entrepreneurship, he continued. What you build is impressive. Thank you. He nodded once. Then he looked toward Emily and David. Connections matter in business, he said thoughtfully. But character matters more. His gaze returned to me. You built something real. It wasn't a dramatic speech, but it carried weight. Because it was the kind of approval my mother had always wanted from people like him. After he walked away, Emily sighed. Well, that was intense. Yeah. We both laughed quietly. A few minutes later, my mom joined us again. She seemed calmer now, but there was still a trace of uncertainty in her voice. Stella, she said carefully. Yes. I was thinking maybe we could all have dinner this week. I tilted my head slightly. Dinner? Yes. Just family. For years, family dinners had been a stage for comparison. A place where my achievements disappeared and Emily's were magnified. But tonight felt different. Not perfect. Not magically fixed. Just different. Maybe, I said. Mom nodded slowly. It wasn't a full reconciliation. But it was the first time she had invited me to something without comparing me to Emily first. Later, as I stepped into the elevator to leave, Emily stopped me. Stella. I turned. She hesitated before speaking. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I smiled. Thanks. The elevator doors closed. And as I rode down to the parking garage, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the invisible daughter anymore. Not because people suddenly admired me, but because I no longer needed them to. 3 months passed after the engagement party. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it definitely changed. For one thing, Harvest Bridge supply kept growing. Our logistics network expanded into 2 more states. We opened a new distribution hub in Oregon, and by the end of that quarter, our platform supported over 8,000 small restaurants and food businesses. Watching those numbers climb felt surreal sometimes, because the goal had never been money. It had always been solving a problem. Small restaurants finally had access to fair supplier pricing. Family-owned bakeries were staying open. Food trucks that once struggled were now profitable. That impact mattered more to me than the valuation ever did. Still, the valuation did something else. It changed how people listened. Investors called more often. Industry conferences invited me to speak. And one morning, while drinking coffee in my apartment, I received an email that made me smile. The business school I had once attended invited me back to give a guest lecture on entrepreneurship. The same university my mom used to say I couldn't handle. I accepted. When the day arrived, I walked into a lecture hall filled with nearly 200 students. Some of them looked nervous. Some looked exhausted. A few looked exactly like I probably did during my sophomore year. Uncertain. Curious. Trying to figure out their future. The professor introduced me simply. Today's guest built a company that helps thousands of small businesses operate more efficiently. There was polite applause. Then the professor added something unexpected. She also did something many people are afraid to do. He smiled. She chose her own path. The students leaned forward slightly. I stepped up to the podium. For a moment, I looked around the room. Then I told them the truth. I left this university during my junior year, I said. A few surprised murmurs moved through the room. My family believed that meant I had failed. More silence. But sometimes, I continued, failure isn't the end of a story. Sometimes it's just the moment when you stop following someone else's expectations. The room grew very quiet. So I kept talking. I explained how the idea for Harvest Bridge Supply started, how small businesses were being overlooked, how solving one practical problem created an opportunity bigger than I ever imagined. And finally, I shared the most important thing I had learned. Success doesn't always look the way people expect. Some students nodded. Others started writing notes. After the lecture, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous. My parents want me to go into corporate law, she said. But I want to start a company. I smiled. That sounds familiar. She hesitated. What if they think I'm making a mistake? I thought about my mother. About all the times she had told people to look at Emily. Then I answered honestly. People can misunderstand you for a long time. But the right path is still the right path. She smiled. Thank you. Later that evening, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. The same dining room where so many comparisons had once happened. But the atmosphere felt different now. Mom asked questions about my work. Real questions. Not dismissive ones. Emily talked about her own career honestly, without trying to prove anything. Even Dad seemed more relaxed. At one point, Mom looked at both of us and said something I never expected to hear. I think I spent too many years comparing you two. Emily and I exchanged a quick glance. Mom continued quietly. That wasn't fair. It wasn't a dramatic apology. But it was enough. Because sometimes growth doesn't come in big emotional speeches. Sometimes it comes in small, honest acknowledgments. And that night, as we finished dinner together, I realized something important. For years I believed my success would prove my family wrong. But that wasn't what actually mattered. What mattered was something simpler. I had built a life on my own terms. Not to compete with my sister. Not to impress my parents. But to create something meaningful. And in the end, that turned out to be the most valuable success of all.